Buenas noches, soy Lourdes Evans y vamos a leer The Book of Regrets de el libro The Midnight Library, escrito por Matt Haig. Nora stared at it. She could see it now, the small typeface embossed on the cover, The Book of Regrets. Every regret you have ever had since the day you were born is recorded in here, Mrs. Elm said, tapping her finger on the cover. I now give you permission to open it. As the book was so heavy, Nora sat down cross-legged on the stone floor to do so. She began to skim through it. The book was divided into chapters, chronologically arranged around the years of her life, 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 35. The chapters got much longer as the book progressed, year by year, but the regrets she accumulated weren't specifically related to the year in question. Regrets ignore chronology. They float around. The sequence of these changes all the time. The sequence of these lists changes all the time. Right, yes, that makes sense, I suppose. She quickly realized they ranged from the minor and quotidian, I regret not doing exercise every day. No, I regret not doing any exercise today, to the substantial, I regret not telling my father I loved him before he died. There were continual background regrets, which repeated on multiple pages. I regret not staying in the labyrinths because I let down my brother. I regret not staying in the labyrinths because I let down myself. I regret not doing more for the environment. I regret the time I spent on social media. I regret not going to Australia with Easy. I regret not having more fun when I was younger. I regret all those arguments with Dad. I regret not working with animals. I regret not doing geology at university instead of philosophy. I regret not learning how to be a happier person. I regret feeling so much guilt. I regret not sticking at Spanish. I regret not choosing science subject in my A levels. I regret not becoming a glaciologist. I regret not getting married. I regret not applying to do a master's degree in philosophy at Cambridge. I regret not keeping healthy. I regret moving to London. I regret not going to Paris to teach English. I regret not finishing the novel I started at university. I regret moving out of London. I regret having a job with no prospects. I regret not being a better sister. I regret not having a gap year after university. I regret disappointing my father. I regret that I teach piano more than I played. I regret my financial mismanagement. I regret not living in the countryside. A lo más negra. Some regrets were a little fainter than others. One regret shifted from practically invisible to bold and back again, as if it was flashing on and off. Right there, as she looked at it, the regret was, I regret not yet having children. And that is a regret that sometimes is and sometimes isn't, explained Mrs. Elm, again somehow reading her mind. There are a few of those. From the age of 34 onwards, in the longest chapter at the end of the book, there were a lot of Dan-specific regrets. These were quite strong and bold and played in her head like an ongoing fortissimo chord in a Haydn concerto. I regret being cruel to Dan. I regret breaking up with Dan. I regret not living in a country pub with Dan. As she stared down at the pages, she thought now of the man she had so nearly married. Regret overload. She'd met Dan while living with Easy in Tooting. Voy a fijar si está grabando esto. Sí, vamos bien. Regret overload. She'd met Dan while living with Easy in Tooting. Big smile, short beard, visually a TV vet. Fun, curious. He drank quite a bit, but always seemed immune to hangovers. He had studied art history and put his in-depth knowledge of Rubens and Tintoretto to incredible use by becoming head of PR for a brand of protein flapjacks. He did, however, have a dream, and his dream was to run a pub in the countryside. A dream he wanted to share with her, with Nora. And she got carried away with his enthusiasm, got engaged, but suddenly she had realized she didn't want to marry him. Deep down, she was scared of becoming her mother. She didn't want to replicate her parents' marriage. Still staring blankly at the Book of Regrets, she wondered if her parents had ever been in love, or if they had got married because marriage was something you did at the appropriate time with the nearest available person. A game where you grabbed the first person you could find when the music stopped. She had never wanted to play that game. Bertrand Russell wrote that, quote, "To fear love is to fear life, and those who fear life are already 3 parts dead," unquote. Maybe that was her problem. Maybe she was just scared of living. But Bertrand Russell had more marriages and affairs than hot dinners, so perhaps he was no one to give advice. When her mom died 3 months before the wedding, Nora's grief was immense. Though she had suggested that the date should be put back, it somehow never was. And Nora's grief fused with depression and anxiety, and the feeling that her life was out of her control. The wedding seemed such a symptom of her chaotic feeling that she felt tied to a train track. And the only way she could loosen the ropes and free herself was to pull out of the wedding. Though in reality, staying in Bedford and being single and letting easy down about their Australia plans and starting work at string theory and getting a cat had all felt like the opposite of freedom. "Oh no," said Mrs. Elm, breaking Nora's thoughts. "It's too much for you." And suddenly she was back, feeling all this contrition, all that pain of letting people down and letting herself down, the pain she had tried to escape less than an hour ago. The regrets began to swarm together. In fact, while staring at the open pages of the book, the pain was actually worse than it had been wandering around Bedford. The power of all the regrets simultaneously emanating from the book was becoming agony. The weight of guilt and remorse and sorrow was too strong. She leaned back on her elbows, dropped the heavy book, and squeezed her eyes shut. She could hardly breathe, as if invisible hands were around her neck. "Make it stop." "Close it now," instructed Mrs. Elm. "Close the book. Not just your eyes, close it. You have to do it yourself." So Nora, feeling like she was about to pass out, sat back up and placed her hand under the front cover. It felt even heavier now, but she managed to close the book and gasped in relief. Every life begins now. Well, Mrs. Elm had her arms folded. Though she looked identical to Mrs. Elm, Nora had always known her manner was definitely a little more brusque. It was Mrs. Elm, but also somehow not Mrs. Elm. It was quite confusing. "Well, what?" Nora said, still gasping, still relieved she could no longer feel the intensity of all her regrets simultaneously. Which regret stands out? Which decision would you like to undo? Which life would you like to try on? She said that precisely. Try on. As if this was a clothes shop and Nora could choose a life as easily as a t-shirt. It felt like a cruel game. That was agony. I felt like I was about to be strangled, What is the point of this? As Nora looked up, she noticed the lights for the first time. Just naked bulbs hanging down from wires attached to the ceiling, which seemed like a normal kind of light gray ceiling, except it was a ceiling that reached no walls. Like the floor here, it went on forever. The point is, there is a strong possibility that your old life is over. You wanted to die, and maybe you will. And you will need somewhere to go to, somewhere to land, another life. So you need to think hard. This library is called the Midnight Library because every new life on offer here begins now. And now it's midnight. It begins now. All these futures, that's what is here. That's what your books represent. Every other immediate present and ongoing future you could have had. So there are no pasts in there? No, just the consequence of them. But those books are also written, and I know them all, but they are not for you to read. And when does each life end? It could be seconds or hours, or it could be days, months, more. If you have found a life you truly want to live, then you get to live it until you die of old age. If you really want to live a life hard enough, you don't have to worry. You will stay there as if you have always been there. Because in one universe you have always been there. The book will never be returned, so to speak. It becomes less of a loan and more of a gift. The moment you decide you want that life, really want it, then everything that exists in your head now, including this midnight library, will eventually be a memory so vague and intangible, it will hardly be there at all. One of the lights flickered overhead. The only danger, continued Mrs. Elm, more ominously, is when you are here, between lives. If you lose the will to carry on, it will affect your root life, your original life, and that could lead to the destruction of this place. You'd be gone forever, you'd be dead, and so would your access to all this. That's what I want. I want to be dead. I would be dead because I want to be. That's why I took the overdose. I want to die. Well, maybe or maybe not. After all, you're still here. Nora tried to get her head around this. So, how do I return to the library if I'm stuck in a life even worse than the one I've just left? It can be subtle, but as soon as disappointment is felt in full, you'll come back here. Sometimes the feeling creeps up, other times it comes all at once. If it never arrives, you'll stay put, and you will be happy there by definition. It couldn't be simpler, so pick something. Pick something you would have done differently, and I will find you the book. That is to say, the life. Nora stared down at the book of regrets lying closed on the yellow-brown floor tiles. She remembered chatting late at night with Dan about his dream of owning a quaint little pub in the country. His enthusiasm had been infectious, and it had almost become her dream too. I wish I hadn't left Dan, and that I was still in a relationship with him. I regret us not staying together and working towards that dream. Is there a life where we're still together? Of course, said Mrs. Elm. The books in the library began to move again, as though the shelves were conveyor belts. This time, though, instead of going as slow as a wedding march, they moved faster and faster and faster until they couldn't really be seen as individual books at all. They just whirred by in streams of green. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Mrs. Elm crouched down and took a book from the lowest shelf to her left. The book was one of the darkest of the darker shades of green. She handed it to Nora. It was a lot lighter than the Book of Regrets. even though it was similar size. Again, there was no title on the spine, but a small one embossed on the front, precisely the same shade as the rest of the book. It said, "My life." "But it's not my life." "Oh, Nora, they are all your lives." "What do I do now?" You open the book and turn to the first page. Nora did so. "Okay," said Mrs. Elm with careful precision. "Now read the first line." Nora stared down and read. She walked out of the pub into the cool night air. And Nora had just enough time to think to herself, "Pub?" After that, it was happening. The text began to swirl and soon became indecipherable in fast motion, as she felt herself weaken. She never knowingly let go of the book, and there was a moment where she was no longer a person reading it, and a consequent moment where there was no book or library at all.